Hi people, hope you're all well. You may get a little bit of background noise. That's Storm Dara. It's been a windy day, so I don't know if that'll come out in the audio or not. Now, before I get into this one, just very, very briefly, I don't usually do this, but I'll probably not make a separate video about it, so I just want to put it out there. Just watched the film yesterday from 2019. Just watched it on Netflix, starring Himesh Patel and Lily James, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a good film. Basically, if you don't know the premise here, I'll just say very briefly. It's about a struggling young musician in Lowestoft, Suffolk. He's just sort of doing very, very minor gigs. He's playing at kind of side events, and he's not having a great deal of success. There's a global blackout for about 12 seconds, and in that time he's hit by a bus, and when he wakes up, it's somehow altered the world. It's never explained in the film, which I don't think is really necessary given that it's a fairly light-hearted film. But basically, yeah, the world has lost all memory of the Beatles, and a few other things, Coca-Cola and a few other things. But basically, as a musician, he then does his cover for Yesterday, and his friends and little mini entourage are blown away by it. And they're very impressed, and they say, "When did you write that?" And he says, "I didn't. Paul McCartney did." But suffice to say, he rises to success, but he finds it deeply uncomfortable. He doesn't like the manufactured nature of the modern music industry, and he feels guilty that he's basically doing what the Beatles done. That's about the gist of it. It's not an overly convoluted film, but I enjoyed it. I think Richard Curtis produced it, Danny Boyle directed it. Check it out if you have Netflix, and if you don't have Netflix, even get the DVD. For a cheap price at CEX or something. It's worth watching. I'll certainly be getting it when I can. It's a good movie. I enjoyed it. Um, that having been said, this video's got nothing to do with that. So, if you're still listening up to now, thank you. I want to talk about this poll that was conducted by the Eye, or not by the Eye, rather for the Eye, by BMG, and this is their cover from the 2nd of December. The British public backs closer EU trade deal over Trump deal. Now, before I get into this, I'll just put my cards on the table. I do as well. Reason being, I have long felt that any sort of trade deal with America is going to be heavily biased towards Washington. It's not even about Trump. I mean, we know Trump's going to put massive tariffs on almost every country, including allied countries. But even if Kamala Harris was president, um, even if Joe Biden had continued, even if it was a Democrat that was in the White House, any American president naturally is going to favor the United States. You wouldn't expect anything less, and I don't blame them for that. They're doing what they should do as a leader of Americans. But the United States has an economy that's roughly, if I've got this correct, 5 or 6 times bigger than the UK. I believe it's somewhere in the region of 15 trillion. We're about 3 trillion. I could be getting that wrong, maybe even higher. Suffice to say, it's a much, much bigger economy than the UK. The UK is a major economy. We are in the top 10 in the world, currently rank around sixth. Similar size to France, but that is just my point. If we had trade deals with countries like France, particularly Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, in fact, in the case of the Netherlands and Ireland, they'd be thinking we're the bigger player because we are. But the point I'm making here is it makes a lot more sense to secure trade deals with countries of similar sized economies. And it makes absolute sense to do what Keir Starmer has been doing, which is to try and get a reset with the EU. Now, the EU is a little bit frustrated. They feel he can go further. But so much of Starmer's premiership has been about the balancing act on so many issues, whether it be Gaza and Israel, whether it be this. Um, I think he's had a tough time as prime minister. I mean, every new prime minister has challenges. I think Starmer has had more challenges than average. I do think he's had. He wanted to do the job. I'm not saying we should sympathise with him necessarily, but I don't envy his position. Put it that way. Um, I think Starmer is right to have these overtures to the EU. I remember on the day after Remembrance Day, he became the first Prime Minister since Churchill in the 50s, in Churchill's second term, I believe. In fact, it was during the war. He became the first Prime Minister since then to accompany a French president to Remembrance Day events, and he did not shun the British commemorations. He later wreathed the cenotaph. That's significant. He's been getting very close to Berlin, which I welcome. Germany's a major economy. It makes absolute sense that we work with them, and we have vested interests against Russian aggression. I just don't understand the mindset of Brexiteers who have this hysterical reaction whenever a British Prime Minister, they've done the same thing with David Cameron, suggests we have good relations with our neighbours. That isn't betraying Brexit. It's not rejoining the EU. It's just this hysterical reaction. I mean, it's almost like these people, hardline Brexiteers, want us to have bad relations with the EU. I get it. They won the referendum. It's democracy. But that doesn't mean we have to just do the cold shoulder with our neighbours. It's ridiculous. So I totally, it's one of the aspects of Starmer's premiership that I think is commendable. I do think he's made efforts there. Probably he can go further. I mean, the European newspaper they had this big thing that was quite critical of Starmer, saying you should go further. But anyway, this is the report on this poll, and it's by Richard Vaughan, the chief political correspondent. Britain wants Sir Keir Starmer to prioritise closer economic ties with the EU or a trade deal with America, new polling shows. A survey by BMG Research conducted exclusively for the paper reveals that voters would prefer to have a stronger relationship with the EU than they would improved trading relations with the United States, arrangements with the US. According to the research, almost half, 49%, of respondents said they wanted a closer trading relationship with the EU when asked what the UK should prioritise when it came to its trade policy. In contrast, just 28% of adults questioned said they would prefer Starmer to pursue closer trade ties with Trump's incoming administration. Figures also show that more voters want closer economic relations with the EU as opposed to keeping the existing arrangements, 47% in favour of stronger links compared to 36% happy with the status quo. Support for closer ties with the EU are strongest among Labour voters, perhaps not surprising, with 68% preferring the government to forge tighter trade bonds with Brussels, as opposed to 21% in favour of better US trade arrangements. The picture is reversed when it comes to Tory voters, though sentiment is not quite as strong, with 36% saying they want better links with the EU compared with 45% calling for better US ties. It comes after it emerged that the government is looking to appoint a Brexit Sherpa to try to reset ties with Brussels. I would not envy his or her position. A lot of compromise involved there, whilst also not getting the chorus of you're betraying Brexit. Last week, a job advert was published stating that the government was looking for a senior civil servant to act as an advisor to Starmer on trade, migration, economic and international issues related to the EU. I need a job. I might just think about that one. The £200,000 a year role um, will lead on the government's renewed relationship with the bloc, and the successful applicant will face significant public scrutiny and political attention, the posting warned. Michael Ellam, a former Treasury official who was Gordon Brown's official spokesman, has been tipped as a frontrunner for the post. Formal EU-UK reset talks are expected to start in late spring. Starmer has insisted that he will try to make Brexit work by securing better trading arrangements with the EU, but has also said he wants to agree better trading terms with the US as well. The government has been warned that it may prove impossible given the need to ensure some level of regulatory alignment. In its displayed down report yesterday, the government was preparing to do a deal with Brussels to allow more EU students to study in the UK in return for closer ties. The Sunday Times reported ministers are considering accepting a programme that would allow young people from the EU to remain in the UK for a fixed period of time if it meant better trading terms and professional standards were recognised. Next week, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves meet will meet with Eurozone ministers to push for better economic relations as part of a dash for growth in the wake of the backlash to her budget. This is the polling. Which should the UK prioritise for its trade policy? A free trade agreement with the USA, This is in November 2024. Labour voters 21%, Conservative voted 45%, so it's clearly split on party lines. A closer trading relationship to the EU, 68% of Labour voters, 36% of Tories. Don't know, 11% for Labour, 17% for the Tories. Prefer not to say no percent of Labour voters and 2% of Tories. Obviously, those figures don't add up because there'll be non-respondents and so on. But anyway, there's a bit there that stands out to me. Ministers that would consider accepting a programme that would allow young people from the EU to remain in the UK for a fixed period of time. Um, and they've downplayed that. Why? I have a question for Brexiteers. I totally understand and agree that you have concerns about migration. I totally understand and agree that we're a sovereign nation and we have to take control, especially in law and order. I totally agree with that. That's why, although I voted to remain, I was never overly enthusiastic about the EU. You know, I voted to remain, and I don't regret that decision. But I was never sort of out in the streets waving an EU flag, and that was not my position. But I will ask this question: What what do Brexit voters fundamentally have against a young Dutch or Czech or German or French student studying in a British university? I mean, that's not permanent. That's the duration of their studies. Some of them settle here, but many will go back to the home nation. Um, in the time that they're a student, they're paying high tuition fees, which is going into the British education system. They are spending, they're buying food in British shops. They are spending in British bars, etc. Um, I just don't understand why anyone would be hostile to that. I remember when I was at university, my social life was basically dominated by um, being with French students, German students, Czech students, British students, obviously. But it was I loved that. I loved that mix. On a personal basis, the social side got a bit too much. It was distracting, but that's for another video. But the point I'm making here is I don't understand this frankly jingoistic mindset of people who would say, "Oh, we don't want any EU students here." Why not? They're contributing in the economy. Um, I just don't understand the hostility to that. And if that is all it takes to have better relations with the EU, I think Starmer should go for it. I don't think he should be hesitant. Sure, he'll get criticism from Brexiteers, and there'll be the same old tired arguments about betraying Brexit. Um, I understand that the free movement of people is one of the key things that Brexiteers were unhappy about, but I'm talking here about a specific group of people, students. They'd have to prove that they were students. They'd have to be registered at a university. I suppose there would be a concern that they might stay on afterwards after they've left university. But honestly, I do think there is too much negativity around migration in general. I understand the contentions around it, and I'm not naive. I don't want an open door policy. I think it's right that we check who's coming in. But honestly, from a cultural perspective, people are worried about, um, things like, for instance, if you had, let's say, an Afghan or an Iranian who maybe had a dubious claim, and they came into this country with very backward attitudes towards women's rights or gay rights, I would say they should be refused entry. But honestly, a Swedish or German or Czech student, um, I don't understand why anyone would have a problem with them in terms of, by the way, that wasn't to disparage all Afghans or Iranians. I think I'm hugely sympathetic to Afghans and Iranians who genuinely need help. For example, Iranian Christians or Afghan interpreters who help the British Army. So I don't want that to be interpreted as a Trumpian style, we should just bar all people from those countries. But just common sense dictates that and Central European countries are going to be a similar culture to the UK. So I don't understand the mindset of hostility towards them in that sense. And if that is all it takes, I hope Starmer does consider it. I guess ministers are playing it down because they know there'll be the criticism from the Tories and from the right. But damn it all, they're the ones in government. Government means sometimes making decisions that will be polarizing. It's a decision that I will support. I just don't see why anyone would have hostility to European students. Um, and in return, British students should be able to work in to study in European universities. But this country, we have world class universities. It just seems a pity that students are now going to be looking elsewhere because of our rigid attitude to this. Um, so if a Czech or Dutch or Spanish student could look to study in Liverpool or Glasgow or Norwich or what have you, and they'll think, well, there's just too much bureaucracy. I'm just going to go to the United States instead. I'll go to Australia instead. It's stupid. We're shooting ourselves in the foot, all for this Brexit dogma. We should respect Brexit. It's what people voted for. So we respect it certainly in terms of legislation. But I do think when it comes to students studying in British universities, I think Starmer should really, really think about this. Because if that is all it takes to have better trading relations with the EU, well, why would we not do it? This is something that will benefit the British economy. It's it's an absolute win for this country. Like I say, those students, they're here for 2 or 3 years. They're spending money in this country. That's helping British shops. It's just I don't understand the attitude of Brexiteers who would be hostile to that. And it should work both ways. British students should be able to study in EU countries. If we are having negotiations, we can maybe negotiate, for instance, for visa-free travel to individual EU countries rather than this new tariff that's been brought in. It's not big. I think it's €7, but it's just a sign of the separation, and I don't like it. It's not a big cost, but that's not the €7, €8, something like that. But that's not the point. The point is just a sign of, well, we are out now. And it saddens me. But I'm not an EU lover. I do think the EU can be arrogant. I do think that it can be. I do understand why people vote for Brexit. I totally get it. Um, and people who I know and respect vote for Brexit. So it's not. But frankly, a lot of the people signing that petition for the general election, I've said this before, in my opinion, they will be the very same people who are going on about Ramonas, right? So it's okay to, call for a petition to remove a government that you don't like that could well be removed in 4 years anyway. You'll have the opportunity to do that in the next general election. Um, People who voted to leave excuse me, to stay in the EU, what choice do they have? They have no choice. Oh, it's Brexit. You have to respect it. People are allowed to change their minds, and I suspect a lot of people who vote for Brexit now regret that. Some will be dogged about it and they'll say they're even more convinced, and that's all right. But I do think the number of people who, I mean, I think if there was a poll done tomorrow, I don't believe 17 million people will vote to leave. I would be very surprised if that was the case. But I also don't think we should have referendums every few years. So I don't think we should have another EU referendum. But I just think that what I dislike about it is the intense dogma that Brexiteers show. And yes, you get some dogma on the other side as well. But just as hate, it's irrational hatred of the EU to the point where a British Prime Minister suggesting closer ties will be met by this chorus of nonsense. You're betraying Brexit. How dare you try to David Cameron face it? Keir Starmer's facing it. It's nonsense. Um, I think it's very parochial and short-sighted. I mean, it makes all the sense in the world to have good relations and good trade deals with our closest neighbours. And yes, with the United States as well. And I'll just close with this point. I'm certainly not anti-American. You know, I think that there is a very old and very important transatlantic tie to the United States. I value that. But it's just a reality. America is a much bigger economy, and no British American trade deal. It's like a coalition government that favors the bigger party. America will always be favourite. But if we had a trade deal with France, for instance, France is a very similar sized economy. So it will be much more egalitarian, much better for this country. So, these Brexit purists, people like Daniel Hannan, for example, it's just that it's just this extreme sort of pro-Trumpian, anti-EU dogma that they just won't think differently. It's just like that's it. And if you don't think that way, then you're betraying Brexit. I have a big problem with that way of thinking. I also have a big problem with the British right subservience to Trump. This idea that, well, he's been re-elected as American president, so we need to be totally subservient to him. I wanted to throw up when I heard Farage say we need to roll out the red carpet. We sure as hell do not need to roll out the red carpet. We can respect Trump's office. He will be American president, and there will be at least one state visit. That's just inevitable. But I really don't see. I would be disappointed if Starmer and Lamy really, really pandered to Trump because they feel they have to. They should be respectful, diplomatic, aim for good relations. Trump supposedly likes the UK. Well, let's see how he responds. But I really don't like or understand the British right's kind of sycophantic attitude to Trump. That isn't respecting the special relationship. That's being subservient from people who claim that they're so patriotic and everyone else isn't. It's a bit hypocritical.